Hello, AP Psychology students. Today we are looking at part 3 of research methods. In particular, we're looking at the experiment and experimental design. A couple of years ago, I ran across this article, and it was an article about how meditation was being used to help close the achievement gap at a inner city school. And what they did was they provided two 15-minute periods of quiet time, and they could practice some form of meditation, or they could engage in other activities like silent reading. One of the premises behind this study was that the students were coming into the school with already so many stressful things in their life that this quiet time would give them an opportunity to sort of focus, become mindful, and not think about the things that are outside of the school period. So their suspensions dropped by 79%, attendance rose to 98%, and the students' GPA rose each year. Now, I'm not sure how much scientific rigor they put into this study, but what it did do was it got me thinking about the concept of anxiety that I see in my students here at EHS, which is in particular test anxiety. It is surprising to me, if you are somebody that experiences test anxiety, it is surprising to me how many students really do feel incredibly anxious during tests. So what I would be interested in doing is an experiment called a between subjects experimental design. This is the most basic type of experiment that we can do in psychology, and it's the introductory level of experimental design. So just follow along on my diagram here, and then I'll explain some experimental design controls as well. So in any experiment, we have the subject population. That is who it is we're actually studying. So if we're doing a study on a drug or a medication for someone with OCD, we would want to have only people that have OCD. From that, we draw a representative sample from a larger pool of people, and it's really important that that sample is drawn randomly. And then we randomly assign them to two groups. One is the control group, they don't get the treatment. One is the experimental group, they do get the treatment. At the conclusion of the study, we measure the behavior of the control group and the experimental group, and then we compare the difference. We use what's called inferential statistics, and we're looking for the probability that the results are not due to chance. And you're going to need to read more about statistics in your text and in a handout I give you later on. But the important thing about the inferential part of this is that you can infer cause and effect. Meanwhile, you need to control for extraneous variables, and I'll talk about what those are in just a minute. And you also need to understand the difference between the independent and the dependent variable. The independent variable is what is manipulated to see if it impacts the targeted behavior, in other words, the dependent variable. So the dependent variable is the outcome factor that may change in response to the IV. All right, so let's take a look at this particular experiment. I'm sorry, backing up just a little bit. If you need help to identify the independent and the dependent variable, just always turn your hypothesis into a question. Does an IV cause a change in the DV? Okay, so my subject of interest here is meditation before a test reduces test anxiety in high school students. That's my hypothesis. So my subject population is going to be high school students, particularly those that are taking tests, which is pretty much any high school student. Now, I need to, of course, identify if that's grade 10 through 12 or grade 9 through 12. And so I've decided that high school students here are grades 10 through 12. I know that in many districts, even our own, ninth graders are involved in the high school population, but for study purposes, I need to be very specific about who my sample is and who my subject population is. Then I need to randomly assign them to groups. So we can do this through a computer generator. We can do it just through drawing a letter or a color of a piece of paper in a hat. But the point is, we want to get this representative sample of all high school students, and then we want to randomly assign them to groups. Okay, so the control group will have no treatment. In other words, they won't do any meditation or silent reflection before the test. And the experimental group will get the treatment. Again, we measure the behavior and we compare the differences. Okay, so this is what I had before. So, does the IV cause a change in the DV? Does meditation cause a change in test anxiety? So the independent variable is going to be the first part of that question, meditation, and then test anxiety is going to be the dependent variable, because we are looking to see if meditation can cause a change in that dependent variable, which is test anxiety. So going back to our model, again, we're looking for statistical significance between the two groups. So how are we going to measure for test anxiety? And here you can see that I have meditation or not. That's the independent variable. And the dependent variable is test anxiety. How can we measure for something like test anxiety? That's a really tough thing. So we need to come up with some kind of a measure that shows how anxious the student is before they begin their test. Now, ultimately, we'd like to find out if they do better on a test. But right now, the topic of interest for me is, does the meditation reduce the test anxiety? Okay, so important design controls. When we are designing a study such as this one, first of all, we need to have operational definition of variables. How are you going to measure the data? They need to be specific and they need to be consistent so that they can be replicated. So for example, when I'm defining meditation, I need to be very specific about meditation is a 15-minute period of silent reflection, or I need to somehow define what I mean by meditation. Okay, so that has to be specific so someone later on can read that study and they can say, okay, so meditation in this study meant that they were doing silent reflection or they were doing a specific writing activity or something like that that calmed them down. It is very important that you choose a random sample from a subject population to get a representative sample. So what does this mean? I would need to get a random sample of high school students, which is my subject population, grade 10 through 12. Then I can be confident that I have a representative sample. If I was doing a study on a new medication for people with post-traumatic stress disorder, I'm going to have to make sure to get a random sample from people who have PTSD, diagnosed PTSD, and then I know that I have a representative sample. I do this to avoid something called sampling bias. When we have a good representative sample, we can generalize to larger populations. Now, if I were to take only students at this school to do my study that I'm talking about, we could really only generalize that to the students at EHS. We could not generalize that to students at South High School or at Edison High School. We would only be able to generalize to EHS students. So you really want to have a good representative sample. Random assignment is very important. This minimizes individual differences between groups. I'm sorry, and I forgot to mention the subject population in this case would be people who have test anxiety. So remember, that is important. They have to be people who have test anxiety. Then we take those people who have test anxiety and we randomly assign them to groups. One group is going to be the experimental group and one group is going to be the control group. So in the experimental group, they would have the session of meditation and the control group would not. And what this does is it minimizes individual differences between groups. Now, it's really important with our groups that we control extraneous variables to avoid confounding of variables. If I were to do this study at this school, I would want to make sure that the room conditions, the time of day, the lighting, the temperature, etc., are the same between my control group and experimental group. This isn't to say that they have to be in the exact same room. They could be in a different room, but maybe they'd want to be in the room right behind me that's set up very similarly to the one that I'm in right now, and I would do it at the same time of day. The only difference that we want to see between the experimental group and the control group is that independent variable, whether or not the students have done meditation. We need to minimize participant bias. So we can disguise the true nature of the research. I wouldn't have to tell the students necessarily that we're in the experimental group, whether or not I was looking at their test anxiety. So I could, but in a study with a drug or a medication, we can use something called a placebo for the control group. So in a really important PTSD study that was done for the drug propranolol, they used a placebo for the people who were in the control group, and they did not know if they were getting the placebo or the actual medication. Now, we use a single blind study when, and that refers to when only the participants in the study do not know which group they are in. If you use a double-blind study in order to minimize experimental bias, then neither the researcher nor the participant knows which group they are in. At the conclusion of the study, the experimenter will get the data, but not until they have done the evaluation of, in the case of the PTSD study, the symptoms of PTSD. In the case of the study I'm talking about, meditation, when the results for whether or not the individuals had test anxiety would need to be tabulated by a third party who's neutral. We would need to use inferential statistics to determine statistical significance. So if the probability is less than 0.05, so if the p, what we call the p-value, is less than 0.05, then it is probable that the differences between the control and the experimental group are not due to chance, but they are due to the effects of the independent variable. This is a very high bar that we set in psychology, a very high standard to show that there are statistically significant results. Now, sometimes if the p-value is a number larger than 0.05, we still can make some inferences about whether or not something is effective, but we can't say that it's statistically significant. If any of my the words that you want to get from this PowerPoint are obscured by my image on the bottom left, I've got this on Schoology, and you should be able to access the PowerPoint as well. So these design controls are super important for you to remember and to just commit to your memory and do complete the ABA that is on your Schoology assignment. Thank you very much for watching, and have a great day.